the scrape of silver against fine bone china. That was the sound that preceded the ruin of the morning. It was Tuesday. The dining room smelled of damp wool, cold eggs, and lingering resentment. Josephine had just reached for the bitter orange marmalade when the word hung in the air, acidic and thick. Broodmare. She didn't gasp. She just stopped breathing. Then came the second sound, louder than the first, the heavy, deliberate clatter of her husband setting down his butter knife. The air in the breakfast room of Oakhaven was always 10 degrees colder than the rest of the manor. It was a cavernous space, designed for intimidation rather than digestion. The walls were lined with dark oak paneling that swallowed the morning light, and the long mahogany table stretched between the three occupants like a battlefield. Josephine sat at the foot. Gideon, the Duke of Rothay, sat at the head. His older sister, Lady Harriet, sat exactly in the middle, a physical barricade of stiff taffeta and thinly veiled contempt. Josephine kept her eyes on her plate. A single poached egg sat on a piece of toast, its yolk congealing in the chill. She wasn't hungry. She hadn't been hungry since she arrived at Oakhaven 3 months ago. Her stomach was a tight, twisted knot of duty and mild nausea, a permanent affliction that tasted faintly of copper. At the other end of the table, the sharp rustle of the morning paper punctuated the silence. Gideon was hidden behind the financial pages. He was a man of precise movements. Turn the page, lift the teacup, set it down, cut the sausage, chew. He did not speak before 9 o'clock, a rule Harriet enforced with the vigilance of a prison guard. "You're pushing your food around again, Josephine," Harriet observed. Her voice was like a wire cutting through cheese, thin, sharp, and bloodless. Josephine froze, the silver fork heavy in her hand. "I am perfectly well, Harriet, just not quite ravenous this morning." "Pity," Harriet said, snapping a piece of dry toast in half. The crumbs fell onto the pristine white tablecloth like coarse sand. "A healthy appetite is a sign of a robust constitution. One would hope, given the exorbitant price tag attached to your arrival, that you possessed at least a peasant's fortitude." Josephine's jaw tightened. She forced herself to swallow the lump forming in her throat. She was the daughter of a northern textile magnate. Her father owned factories that smelled of raw cotton, machine oil, and sweat. He had bought her this title with a dowry large enough to repair Oakhaven's rotting roof, clear Gideon's ancestral debts, and keep Harriet in silk dresses for the next decade. They all knew it. It was a transaction. But Harriet treated the money as if it had magically appeared in the family coffers by divine right, while treating Josephine as something scraped off the bottom of a boot. "I assure you," Josephine said, keeping her voice level, "my constitution is entirely adequate." "Adequate?" Harriet scoffed, taking a slow sip of her tea. Her pale eyes flicked toward Gideon, who hadn't lowered his newspaper. "We need more than adequate, don't we? 3 months, and you still look as hollow-cheeked and frail as the day you arrived. If you were a horse, I'd have the vet round to check your teeth." Josephine felt a hot flush creep up her neck, clashing violently with the cold air of the room. She looked at Gideon. The newspaper remained utterly still. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. "I am not a horse, Harriet," Josephine said, her voice shaking just a fraction. It was a mistake. Showing weakness to Harriet was like bleeding in front of a shark. Harriet smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "No, you aren't. A decent thoroughbred has pedigree. We needn't pretend you are here for your sparkling conversation, my dear, or your bloodline. You are here for one purpose. You are a broodmare, and currently a rather defective one. So I suggest you eat your eggs." The word hit the table with a physical weight. Broodmare. Josephine didn't cry. She didn't throw her napkin down in a fit of melodramatic rage. Instead, a profound, sickening hollowness hollowed out her ribs. The cruelty of it wasn't the insult itself, but the absolute, undeniable truth of it. She was here to breed. She was a womb purchased with factory money. And so far, every month had brought the familiar, damning ache in her lower back, followed by the silent, shameful bleeding that meant she had failed again. The silence in the room was absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Then Gideon lowered the newspaper. He didn't fold it. He just let it drop onto the table, covering a silver marmalade spoon. He picked up his heavy silver butter knife. He looked at the blade for a fraction of a second. Clack. He set it down on the porcelain rim of his plate. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp enough to make Harriet flinch. Gideon looked at his sister. His face was a mask of aristocratic boredom, but the muscle in his jaw was ticking, a rapid rhythmic pulse beneath the skin. He was a handsome man, but severely drawn, smelling invariably of sandalwood and rain. "Harriet," he said. His voice was entirely devoid of heat. It was flat. Cold. "Yes, Gideon?" Harriet's voice had lost an octave of its usual confidence. "You will pack your trunks." Harriet blinked, a slow, confused flutter of pale lashes. I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Gideon said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her with the detached interest of an entomologist studying a struggling beetle. "You will pack your trunks. The carriage will be brought round to the front steps at noon. You are going to Bath, to Aunt Agatha's." "Bath?" Harriet gasped, her hands fluttering to the high collar of her dress. "Gideon, it is November. Bath is insufferable in November, and Agatha is a lunatic." "Then you will be in excellent company," he replied. "You cannot be serious," Harriet sputtered, her composure cracking, revealing the ugly, desperate entitlement beneath. "Over a joke? A simple observation? I am your sister. I have run this house for 10 years, and now you do not," Gideon said. He stood up. He was a tall man, and the way he loomed over the table seemed to suck the remaining air from the room. "You will leave by noon. If you are still here at 1 minute past, I will have the footman carry your belongings into the mud, and you can walk to the station." He didn't look at Josephine. He didn't offer her a comforting glance or a chivalrous hand. He simply turned on his heel, his heavy leather boots echoing on the hardwood floor, and walked out of the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing the finality of his words. Josephine sat frozen, the word broodmare still ringing in her ears, watching Harriet's face turn the color of soured milk. Josephine did not stay to watch Harriet cry. The older woman's shock was rapidly devolving into a wet, indignant sputtering, and Josephine found she had no stomach for it. She pushed her chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. She didn't excuse herself. She simply stood, the heavy wool of her morning dress dragging against her ankles, and walked out. She didn't know where she was going until she found herself in the small, glass-paneled conservatory at the back of the house. It was the only room in Oakhaven that didn't feel like a mausoleum. It smelled of damp earth, crushed fern leaves, and the sharp, citrusy tang of wintering geraniums. She sank onto a wrought iron bench, ignoring the chill of the metal seeping through her skirts. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, trying to force them still. Why was she trembling? It wasn't fear. It was an overwhelming, suffocating wave of humiliation. Broodmare. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the conservatory wall. Outside, a fine, misty rain had begun to fall, blurring the edges of the manicured gardens. Harriet was right. That was the splinter under Josephine's fingernail, the agonizing truth she couldn't pull out. Her father, a man with coal dust perpetually stained into the creases of his knuckles, had bought her a duke. He had paid for the crumbling estate, paid for the servants, paid for the very toast Harriet had been eating, and in exchange, Josephine was to provide an heir with a title. It was a contract. She had signed the marriage registry with a steady hand, knowing exactly what was expected of her. Yet hearing it stripped of its polite societal veneer, hearing it spat across a breakfast table like a curse, it made her feel utterly, hopelessly cheap. She closed her eyes, the memory of her wedding night forcing its way into her mind. It hadn't been brutal, but it had been relentlessly efficient. Gideon had come to her room in the dark. He had smelled of brandy and heavily milled soap. He had spoken only a few quiet, instructional words. It was an act of biological necessity, completely devoid of warmth. When it was over, he had pulled his dressing gown around himself, bid her a polite good night, and returned to his own chambers. For 3 months they had repeated this silent, mechanical waltz. And for 3 months, Josephine's body had betrayed her, remaining stubbornly, emptily her own. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach. The corset dug into her ribs, a rigid cage of whalebone and silk. She hated this body. She hated that its worth was measured entirely by its capacity to swell. Footsteps sounded on the stone path outside the conservatory. Josephine straightened up, hurriedly swiping a stray, traitorous tear from the corner of her eye. She expected a servant, perhaps coming to tend the fires. Instead, the glass door creaked open, and the heavy scent of sandalwood and wet wool drifted in. Gideon stood in the doorway. He looked entirely out of place among the delicate ferns and fragile glass. He was a man built for dark wood and leather, not sunlight and flora. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at her, his dark eyes sweeping over her rigid posture, her pale face, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. "She is packing," he said finally. His voice was low, the rumble of a distant train. "You didn't have to do that," Josephine said. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears. "I did." "She is your sister. This is her home." "This is my house," Gideon corrected, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him. The space instantly felt too small. "And you are my wife. There is a hierarchy to these things." Harriet forgot her place. Josephine let out a short, humorless breath that sounded uncomfortably like a laugh. "Her place? Or mine?" Gideon frowned. The lines around his mouth deepened. "I do not understand you. She was only saying what everyone else in this house thinks," Josephine said, the words spilling out before she could catch them. The humiliation was calcifying into anger, a hot, bright spark in her chest. She was just vulgar enough to say it out loud. Gideon walked over to a large terracotta pot holding a struggling lemon tree. He stared at the leaves for a long moment. "She insulted you. I will not have my wife spoken to like a dog in my own dining room." "Your wife," Josephine repeated, tasting the word. It felt foreign on her tongue. "Or your investment." Gideon turned his head sharply. His eyes narrowed. "Do not be entirely foolish, Josephine. We both know the nature of our arrangement. Your father was very explicit in his demands, as was I in mine." "Yes," Josephine said, standing up. She was several inches shorter than him, but she refused to tilt her chin up. She looked squarely at his chest. "Money for blood. A factory fortune to patch the holes in your roof. And in return, I give you a son to inherit it all. I know the contract, Gideon. I know I am a broodmare." Gideon flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a sudden tightening of the muscles in his neck, but she saw it. "Do not use that word," he said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a dangerous, rough edge. "Why? Because it's ugly?" Josephine challenged, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could smell the rain on his coat, the wool rough and damp. "Or because it's true?" "Because it is vulgar," he snapped, taking a step toward her. "Because you are the Duchess of Rothay, and you will not speak of yourself like livestock." "Then don't treat me like it." The shout tore from her throat, startling them both. The sound bounced off the glass walls, harsh and ringing. Silence crashed back into the room. Josephine stood panting, her chest heaving against the strict confines of her corset. She had never raised her voice to him. She had never raised her voice to anyone since she was a child in the smog-choked streets of Manchester. Gideon looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in 3 months, his gaze wasn't politely detached or calculating. He looked at the high flush in her cheeks, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat, the way her hands were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at her sides. He didn't look angry. He looked unnerved. He reached out slowly, his large hand hesitating in the air for a fraction of a second before his fingers brushed the sleeve of her dress. The fabric was coarse wool. It scratched against his skin. "I have never treated you like livestock," he said, the words slow as if he were carefully selecting each syllable. "You come to my room in the dark," she whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her, leaving her exhausted and hollow. "You do not speak to me. You do not look at me. You do your duty and you leave. You check your pocket watch before you knock on my door, Gideon. I have seen you do it." Gideon's hand dropped. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving him looking older, infinitely tired. "I am unaccustomed to sharing my life," he said stiffly. "I am unaccustomed to women." "You are unaccustomed to humanity," she corrected bitterly. He didn't argue. He turned away, looking back out through the rain-streaked glass. "Harriet leaves at noon. She will not return unless you invite her. The servants will be instructed that any disrespect toward you will result in immediate dismissal without character." It was a clinical response to an emotional bleed. It was exactly what she should have expected from him. "Thank you," she said, her voice deadened. He nodded once, sharply, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the brass handle. "I check my watch, Josephine, because I am acutely aware of how much you despise my presence. I try not to overstay my welcome." He opened the door and walked out into the rain, leaving the door slightly ajar. The cold air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and impending winter. Josephine stood perfectly still, the silence of the conservatory suddenly deafening. The carriage left exactly at noon. Josephine watched from the high window of her bedchamber. The heavy black lacquered carriage, bearing the Rothay crest on its door, rolled slowly down the gravel drive. The wheels ground loudly against the stones, a wet, heavy crunching sound that cut through the steady drizzle. Harriet had not come to say goodbye. Josephine hadn't expected her to. She watched until the carriage disappeared past the iron gates at the edge of the property, swallowed by the gray mist rolling off the moors. She expected to feel a surge of triumph. The dragon had been slain, or at least banished to Bath. But there was no victory in her chest, only a strange, unsettled twisting in her gut. "I check my watch because I am acutely aware of how much you despise my presence." His words echoed in the quiet room. Did she despise him? Josephine turned away from the window and looked at her room. It was a beautiful prison. Heavy velvet curtains, a massive four-poster bed draped in expensive silks, a vanity table littered with silver-backed brushes she never used. It was everything her father had wanted for her, but it felt like a stage set. She walked over to the wash basin. The water in the porcelain pitcher was tepid. She poured it anyway, splashing it over her face, shivering as the chill hit her skin. She grabbed a linen towel and pressed it to her eyes, breathing in the scent of harsh lye soap. She needed to see him, not in the dark, not across a mahogany battlefield. She dropped the towel, smoothed her skirts, and walked out of the room. The corridors of Oakhaven were silent. The servants were practically gliding along the edges of the walls, terrified of making a sound in the wake of the Duke's wrath. Josephine walked past them without a word, her soft leather slippers making no sound on the threadbare Persian runners. Gideon's study was on the ground floor, tucked away in the west wing. It was a room Josephine had only been in twice, once to sign the final marriage papers, and once to retrieve a misplaced book. She didn't knock. She didn't want to give him the opportunity to put on his mask of aristocratic indifference. She turned the heavy brass knob and pushed the door open. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, leather bindings, and the sharp metallic tang of ink. A fire was struggling in the grate, smoking more than it burned, a testament to the damp wood the estate was forced to use to save money. Gideon was sitting at his massive desk. He wasn't working. He was just sitting there, staring at a ledger, a pen held loosely in his right hand. A single drop of black ink was gathering at the nib, threatening to fall and ruin the page. He looked up as she entered. He didn't look surprised, just wary. "Josephine," he said, setting the pen down carefully. The ink drop fell, splattering like a tiny black star on the polished wood of the desk. "She is gone," Josephine said, stopping a few feet away from the desk. "I know. I heard the carriage." "Are you angry with me?" she asked. It was a childish question, but it tumbled out before she could stop it. Gideon sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the most human gesture she had ever seen him make. "Why would I be angry with you? You did not call yourself a horse. You banished your sister because of me, your family." "Harriet is blood. She's not family," he said, his voice flat. "Family requires a modicum of loyalty. Harriet is loyal only to her own comfort." He leaned back in his leather chair. The leather creaked loudly in the quiet room. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and purple. "Why did you come down here, Josephine?" he asked, not unkindly. "It is cold. You should be by the fire in your sitting room." "I don't want to sit by a fire by myself," she said, wrapping her arms around her waist. The corset dug sharply into her ribs. "I want to know what happens now." "Now?" "Yes, now. Harriet is gone. The house is quiet. It is just us and the contract." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I told you not to speak of it like that." "But it is what it is, Gideon." She stepped closer to the desk, her hand slapping against the edge of the wood. The sudden sound made him flinch. "I'm not an idiot. I know my father bought me a duke, and I know you sold your title to save this crumbling, freezing house. I accepted that. But I will not live the next 40 years in silent, polite agony, waiting for you to check your pocket watch before you touch me." Gideon stared at her. His chest was rising and falling in a slow, deep rhythm. "What do you want from me, Josephine?" "I want you to look at me," she demanded, her voice cracking. "I'm 22 years old. I read poetry. I hate the taste of marmalade. I'm terrified of dogs. I have a scar on my left knee from falling off a bicycle. I am a person, Gideon. I'm not just a vessel for your bloodline." The fire popped loudly in the grate, sending a shower of orange sparks onto the stone hearth. Gideon stood up slowly. He didn't walk around the desk. He stood leaning over it, his knuckles resting on the ledger. "I know you hate marmalade," he said quietly. Josephine blinked, the anger faltering in her chest. "What?" "I know you hate marmalade," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You push it to the edge of your plate every morning. You drink your tea black because you cannot stand the skin that forms on the milk. You rub your thumb against your wedding ring when you are nervous. And when you sleep, when you finally sleep, you curl into a tight ball on the extreme left side of the mattress, as if you are trying to take up as little space as possible in my bed." Josephine stared at him, her mouth slightly open. She hadn't realized he noticed anything at all in the dark. "I am a terrible husband, Josephine," Gideon continued, looking down at his hands. "I know this. I was raised by ghosts in a house that was dying. I do not know how to be warm. I do not know how to be human in the way you are asking me to be." He looked up at her, his dark eyes stripped of their usual armor. They were desperate and incredibly sad. "I did not marry you just for the money," he confessed, the words sounding like they were being dragged out of him with rusty hooks. "I married you because the day your father brought you to my club to introduce us, you looked around that room full of earls and lords, and you looked profoundly bored. You looked like you saw exactly what we all were, dying dinosaurs in expensive suits. I admired that." Josephine felt a strange tightness in her throat. "You never told me that." "I do not know how to say these things," he admitted, his voice rough. "I know I treat our marriage like a ledger. It is the only way I know how to function. If I calculate the debt, if I perform the duty, then the chaos of feeling is kept at bay." "But I'm not a ledger," she whispered. "No," he agreed softly. "You are not." He finally walked around the heavy wooden desk. He stopped a foot away from her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight silvering at his temples. He smelled of tobacco and that clean, sharp scent of rain. He reached out, much like he had in the conservatory, but this time he didn't hesitate. He gently took her left hand. His fingers were warm, calloused from riding. He rubbed his thumb over the cold gold of her wedding band. "I will stop checking my watch," he said, his voice unsteady. "I will try to see you. The girl who hates dogs and reads poetry. I cannot promise I will be good at it, but I will try." Josephine looked down at their joined hands. The contrast was stark, his large, dark hand swallowing her pale, trembling one. It wasn't a grand romantic declaration. There were no sweeping promises of eternal love. It was awkward, halting, and painfully honest. And for the first time since she arrived at Oakhaven, Josephine didn't feel entirely cold. She gently squeezed his fingers. "Then I will try not to curl up on the extreme edge of the bed." A small, genuine smile touched the corner of Gideon's mouth. It changed his entire face, making him look suddenly younger, less burdened. "We shall start there, then," he murmured. The silence that fell between them wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the breakfast table. It was fragile, tentative, like the first thin sheet of ice on a winter pond. They were still strangers. They were still bound by a contract born of desperation and greed. But the venomous word broodmare had burned away the polite fiction of their arrangement, leaving only the raw, messy reality behind. And perhaps, Josephine thought, looking up into her husband's uncertain eyes, reality was a better place to start. That night, the heavy oak door to Josephine's bedchamber did not open with its usual stealthy click. It opened normally, the brass hinges letting out a faint, metallic groan. Josephine was already in bed, rigid on the extreme left edge, her knees pulled tight toward her chest. She had extinguished the main lamps, leaving only a single sputtering tallow candle on the bedside table. It threw long, distorted shadows against the flocked wallpaper. Gideon stepped into the room. He was wearing his heavy dressing gown, the dark blue wool absorbing the meager light. For the first time, she noticed he was not holding his gold pocket watch. His hands were empty, thrust deep into his pockets. He stopped at the foot of the bed. The silence between them was no longer the suffocating vacuum of the breakfast room. It was thick, heavy with the unsaid, vibrating like a plucked wire. He didn't state his purpose. He didn't offer a polite, clipped greeting. He just looked at the vast expanse of the mattress between them. "I have instructed Mrs. Higgins to stop ordering the marmalade," he said suddenly. His voice was jarring in the quiet room. Josephine blinked, her cheek pressing against the cold linen pillowcase. "What?" "The marmalade," Gideon repeated, shifting his weight. The floorboards creaked. "I told the housekeeper it was no longer required. You will have strawberry preserves tomorrow. Or perhaps plum. Whatever it is they boil down in the kitchens." It was a ridiculous conversation to have in the dark, standing at the foot of a marriage bed. It was absurd. It was the most profound thing he had ever said to her. "Thank you," she said. Her voice caught, sounding smaller than she intended. Gideon nodded, a jerky, unnatural movement. He walked around to the right side of the bed. He didn't blow out the candle immediately, which was a break in protocol. Usually the darkness was his shield. He pulled back the heavy down comforter and climbed in. The mattress dipped under his weight. Josephine gripped the edge of her pillow, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from him, bridging the cold space between them. He smelled of pear soap and the faint, lingering ash of his study. He lay on his back, staring up at the velvet canopy. Minutes ticked by. The only sound was the distant, restless wind rattling the loose panes of the sash window. "My knee," Josephine whispered into the dark. Gideon turned his head on the pillow. "Pardon?" "The scar. You mentioned it this morning. You noticed it." "I did. I was 12, she said, her voice a fragile thread in the gloom. My father had just bought me a bicycle. It was absurdly expensive, imported from France. I rode it straight into the brick wall of the finishing room at the mill. I tore my dress to ribbons and bled all over the cobblestones. My father didn't care about the dress. He was furious about the bicycle. She didn't know why she was telling him this. It was an ugly, unrefined memory. It smelled of engine oil and raw cotton. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Then she heard the rustle of the sheets. His hand moved across the expanse of the bed. It didn't reach for her waist or her thigh, as it usually did in his efficient, detached routine. His fingers blindly found her wrist. His grip was loose, tentative. The calluses on his thumbs scraped gently against her pulse point. "My father broke my collarbone when I was 14, Gideon said. His voice was stripped entirely of its aristocratic cadence. It sounded raw, like torn meat. He had lost 3,000 pounds at the tables in London. He came home, found me struggling to translate Cicero, and threw a crystal decanter at my chest." Josephine stopped breathing. Her fingers twitched under his. "He told everyone I fell off a horse," Gideon continued, staring back up at the canopy. "Harriet perpetuated the lie. She said I was clumsy. It took 6 weeks to knit back together. It still aches when it rains." The sheer brutality of the confession hung in the air, heavy and metallic. This was the great Duke of Rothay, a man beaten by a gambling addict, protected by a cruel sister, living in a decaying monument to his own misery. Josephine turned her hand over, lacing her smaller fingers through his. She didn't offer pity. She knew he would hate it. She just held his hand, grounding him in the cold, drafty room. They didn't have sex that night. The biological imperative was entirely forgotten. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the cold forced Josephine to shift. Without waking, Gideon turned on his side and pulled her backward, slotting her spine against his chest. His heavy arm wrapped around her waist, pinning her to him. For the first time in 3 months, Josephine did not sleep on the extreme left edge of the mattress. She slept in the middle, surrounded by the smell of sandalwood and rain, and she did not dream. The tentative peace lasted exactly 4 days. In that time, the atmosphere at Oakhaven shifted. It was a microscopic change. The servants stopped walking on their tiptoes. Josephine found the courage to ask a footman to open the heavy drapes in the drawing room, letting the weak winter sunlight bleach the dust motes in the air. At breakfast, there was plum preserve. Gideon was still a quiet man. He still hid behind his newspaper, but occasionally he would lower it, catch her eye, and a silent, acknowledging look would pass between them. It wasn't love. It was a truce. Then came Thursday. Josephine was in the library, tracing the cracked leather spine of a first edition she was too intimidated to open, when she heard the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel. She walked to the window. It wasn't the heavy black Rothay carriage returning with Harriet. It was a sleek, lacquered landau, pulled by 2 perfectly matched grays. A footman scrambled to open the door, and a woman stepped out. Even from the second-floor window, Josephine felt a cold spike of inadequacy. The woman was tall, draped in bottle-green velvet that looked impervious to the damp air. A vibrant fox fur was slung over one shoulder. She moved with a languid, predatory grace that only came from a lifetime of knowing you owned the ground you walked on. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Higgins appeared in the library doorway, her face pinched. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, executing a stiff curtsy. "Lady Diana Wyndham is in the drawing room. She insists on seeing you and the Duke." Josephine closed her eyes. Lady Diana. She had seen the name in the social columns her father used to shove under her nose. The widow of a viscount, old money, old blood, a fixture of Gideon's world. "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins. Please inform my husband." When Josephine entered the drawing room, the space reeked of stale violet water and damp fur. Diana was standing by the fireplace, running a gloved finger along the mantelpiece. "Oh, look at you," Diana purred as Josephine walked in. She didn't curtsy. She barely inclined her head. Her eyes, a sharp, crystalline blue, swept over Josephine's simple wool day dress, cataloging the cost and finding it wanting. "You must be the new Duchess." "Harriet wrote to me, of course, but words hardly do justice. You are so incredibly young." It wasn't a compliment, it was an accusation. "Lady Wyndham," Josephine said, keeping her spine rigid. "Welcome to Oakhaven. I apologize, but we were not expecting guests. I never wait for an invitation to Oakhaven, Diana said, waving a dismissive hand. She sank into one of the wingback chairs without being asked. Gideon and I go back decades. I knew this house when it was actually alive. Poor Harriet, shipped off to Bath. She must be absolutely devastated. She held this place together with spit and string for years. The implication was clear. Harriet belonged here. You do not. Before Josephine could formulate a polite, icy response, the doors opened. Gideon strode in. He had been out riding. His boots were splattered with mud, his hair windswept. Diana, he said. There was no surprise in his voice, only a weary resignation. Darling, Diana drawled, holding out a hand. Gideon took it, bowing slightly over her knuckles. It was a fluid, effortless gesture of aristocracy. Josephine felt a sudden, sharp twist in her gut. She had never seen him move quite like that with her. It was the ease of shared history, of a language spoken in a dialect she could not mimic. To what do we owe the pleasure? Gideon asked, moving to stand by the cold fireplace, explicitly not standing next to Josephine. Just passing through on my way to Yorkshire, Diana lied smoothly. I had to see for myself if the rumors were true. The great Duke of Rothay, married, his debts miraculously cleared, and Harriet exiled. You've been busy, Gideon. She turned her sharp gaze back to Josephine. And I see the northern industrial spirit is already making its mark. The drapes are open. How terribly bright. I suppose when one is used to factory floors, one craves the light. Josephine's hands curled into fists in the folds of her skirt. The corset suddenly felt too tight, restricting the air in her lungs. The fragile confidence she had built over the last 4 days shattered like cheap glass. She looked at Gideon. She expected him to say something, to deliver one of his flat cutting remarks, just as he had with Harriet. But Gideon just sighed, pulling a silver cigar case from his pocket. Do not start, Diana. I'm not in the mood. Start what? Diana laughed, a high, tinkling sound. I am merely making conversation. It is a pragmatic match. Everyone in London knows it. There is no shame in survival, Gideon. Your father left you a sinking ship. You found a lifeboat. A lifeboat, a broodmare, a ledger entry, a transaction. Josephine couldn't breathe. The smell of violets was choking her. Gideon was looking at his cigar case, his jaw tight, but he wasn't looking at her. He was enduring Diana, treating her like bad weather, but he wasn't stopping her, because Diana wasn't Harriet. Diana was an equal. If you will excuse me, Josephine said. Her voice shook, betraying her. I have matters to attend to. She didn't wait for permission. She turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps quickening into a near run as she hit the hallway. She heard Diana's soft, mocking laugh echo against the oak paneling. Well, a bit highly strung, isn't she? Must be the manufacturing blood. And worst of all, she didn't hear Gideon reply. Josephine didn't stop in her bedroom. She kept going, down the back stairs, through the cavernous stone-flagged kitchens, and out the heavy scullery door. The air outside was biting, smelling of wet dead leaves and impending frost. She didn't have a cloak. She was still wearing her indoor slippers. She didn't care. She just needed to be out of that house, away from the suffocating weight of centuries of judgment. She walked toward the moors at the back of the estate. The manicured lawns quickly gave way to rough, untamed earth. The ground was saturated from the recent rain, a thick, sucking mire of mud and peat. Within 10 steps, her thin leather slippers were soaked through. The heavy wool of her hem dragged in the mud, growing heavier with every step, staining the expensive fabric black. She forced herself to keep walking, the cold biting into her arms, her chest heaving. The tears came then, hot, angry, humiliated tears that blurred her vision. She was a fool. She had spent 3 nights sleeping next to a man who had shown her a sliver of vulnerability, and she had built a fantasy out of it. She had thought they were allies. But in the daylight, under the scrutiny of his own kind, he had let a woman in a fox fur call her a lifeboat. He was embarrassed by her. Her father's money had bought the Duke, but it couldn't buy his respect. "Josephine!" The shout carried over the wind, rough and urgent. She didn't stop. She pushed further into the tall, wet bracken, her breathing ragged. "Josephine, stop!" Heavy boots pounded against the soft earth. He caught up to her easily, grabbing her upper arm and spinning her around. Gideon was breathing hard, his hair plastered to his forehead by the damp wind. He had thrown off his tailored coat. He was only in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, the cold clearly not registering. "What in God's name are you doing?" he demanded, his grip on her arm tight. "You have no coat. You will catch your death in this wind." "Let go of me," she hissed, yanking her arm away. She stumbled backward, her ruined shoes slipping in the mud. Gideon looked down at her feet, at the thick black muck coating the hem of her expensive dress. His eyes widened in disbelief. "You are ruining your clothes. You are acting like a child. Get back to the house." "No!" she shouted, the word ripping out of her throat. The wind whipped her loose hair across her face. "Go back to your drawing room. Go back to your friend and tell her how pragmatic it is that you married the factory girl." Gideon's face darkened, the aristocratic mask slamming back into place. "Diana is a guest. She is a widow and an old acquaintance. I will not cause a scene in my own house just because you are overly sensitive." "Sensitive?" Josephine let out a wet, bitter laugh. "She called me a lifeboat to my face. She insulted my father. She insulted me. And you stood there looking at your damn cigar case." "I told her to stop," Gideon argued, stepping closer. "Diana is venomous by nature. Engaging with her only fuels it. I handled it." "You handled nothing." Josephine shoved both her hands against his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall, but the physical act felt necessary. "You stood there and let her remind me exactly what I am to you. You let her put me back in my place. Because God forbid the Duke of Rothay offend a viscount's widow to defend the merchant's daughter he bought to pay his bills." "Stop talking about the money," Gideon snarled. He stepped into her space, crowding her, the heat of his body radiating against the biting wind. "Why? Are you ashamed of it?" she challenged, throwing her head back to glare up at him, tears mixing with the freezing mist on her cheeks. "Are you ashamed of me? Is it easier in the dark, Gideon, when you can't see the factory dirt on me?" Gideon's jaw clenched so hard she thought his teeth might crack. His eyes were black, furious. "You think this is easy for me?" he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "You think I know how to navigate this? I banished my sister for you. I tore up the very fabric of how this house operates for you. And the moment an unpleasant woman walks into the room, you run out into the mud and accuse me of treating you like dirt." "'Cause you didn't look at me," she cried, the core of her hurt finally cracking open. "When Harriet called me a broodmare, you looked at her and you ended it. But today you looked away, Gideon. You chose her world over me." Gideon stared at her. The wind howled around them, snapping the wet bracken against their legs. He looked at her wet, shivering shoulders, her ruined dress, the absolute raw devastation in her eyes. The anger seemed to drain out of him all at once, replaced by a profound, agonizing frustration. "I didn't look away because I chose her world," he said, his voice cracking, shedding its polished restraint. "I looked away because I was ashamed." Josephine froze, her breath catching in her chest. "Ashamed of me?" "Of me!" Gideon yelled, the sound tearing over the moor. He grabbed her arms, not painfully, but with a desperate intensity. He pulled her against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He smelled of rain, sweat, and pure adrenaline. "I was ashamed of myself." He breathed heavily against her skin, the warmth of his breath contrasting violently with the cold air. "Because Diana knew my father. She knew the debts. She was there when the bailiffs came to the London townhouse." Looking at her, it reminded me of exactly what a failure I am, that I couldn't save my own house, that I had to buy a bride to survive. He pulled his head back, his hand sliding up to cup her freezing face. His thumb smeared the mud and tears on her cheeks. His eyes were entirely stripped bare, red-rimmed and frantic. "You are not the lifeboat, Josephine," he whispered fiercely, his voice shaking. "I am the drowning man, and I was terrified that if I looked at you in that room, you would see exactly how pathetic I really am." Josephine stared at him. The arrogant Duke was gone. The cold, mechanical husband was gone. In his place was just a man, deeply scarred, terribly proud, and bleeding out in front of her in the freezing mud. Her internal contradictions shattered. She was furious. She was exhausted. She was so incredibly cold. She reached up, her mud-stained hands gripping the lapels of his clean waistcoat. "You are a fool, Gideon," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I know," he said, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. She didn't say anything else. She simply pulled him down by his lapels. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't polite. It was a violent collision of teeth and cold lips. Gideon groaned, a harsh, guttural sound, and his arms wrapped around her like steel bands, crushing her against his chest. He kissed her with a ravenous, desperate heat, as if she were oxygen, and he had been holding his breath for 10 years. He didn't care about the mud ruining his clothes. He didn't care about the wind or the cold. His hands tangled in her wet hair, anchoring her to him in the desolate landscape. It was clumsy, it was wet, and it tasted faintly of salt and rain. When they finally broke apart, both of them were gasping for air. Gideon rested his forehead against hers, his chest heaving against hers. "We are going back to the house," he commanded softly, his voice still ragged. "Diana is in the drawing room," Josephine pointed out, though she made no move to step out of his arms. "Let her sit there," Gideon said, his thumb stroking her jawline, leaving a streak of mud across her pale skin. "Let her rot there. I do not care. I'm taking my wife upstairs." He didn't wait for her to agree. He bent down, sliding one arm behind her knees and the other around her back, and lifted her out of the mud. Josephine gasped, instinctively throwing her arms around his neck. She was heavy in her soaked wool and corset, but he carried her effortlessly, striding back toward the looming stone silhouette of Oakhaven. The transaction was over. The marriage had finally begun. The heavy oak doors of the main entrance did not simply open. Gideon kicked them in. They hit the interior walls with a resounding crack that echoed through the cavernous foyer. Thomas, the elderly butler, dropped a silver polishing cloth on the parquet floor. He stared, mouth agape, as the Duke of Rothay marched into the pristine hallway carrying his mud-soaked wife. Drops of black, peaty sludge fell from Josephine's ruined hem, splattering against the ancient, priceless Aubusson carpet. Gideon did not look down. He did not care. "Hot water, Thomas," Gideon barked, his voice bouncing off the high, vaulted ceiling. "A bath in my wife's chambers. Now." Before the butler could scramble into action, the double doors of the drawing room slid open. Lady Diana stepped into the hall. She still wore her pristine bottle-green velvet, her fox fur perfectly draped. The scent of stale violets followed her, cutting through the raw smell of earth and rain radiating from Gideon and Josephine. Diana froze. Her sharp blue eyes darted from Gideon's mud-streaked face to Josephine's ruined clothes, to the abhorrent mess trailing across the heirloom rug. "Good God, Gideon!" Diana breathed, her cultivated languor vanishing into sheer, visceral disgust. "What has happened? Have you been dragged through a ditch?" Gideon stopped at the base of the grand staircase. He didn't set Josephine down. He merely shifted her weight higher against his chest. The muscles in his jaw locked. "My wife caught a chill on the moor, Diana," he said. His tone was no longer the weary tolerance he had shown her in the drawing room. It was absolute, freezing absolute zero. "A chill?" Diana scoffed, stepping forward, her gaze raking over Josephine. "She looks like a vagrant. This is what comes of letting commoners run loose on an estate. Look at the carpet. It is ruined." "It is a piece of fabric," Gideon said, his voice dropping dangerously low. Just like your coat, just like my title. Moths will eat it eventually. Diana recoiled as if he had struck her. Her pale skin flushed an ugly, mottled pink. Gideon! You were just leaving, he stated. It wasn't a question. Have a safe journey to Yorkshire. I suggest you do not stop here on your return. He didn't wait for her to gasp, or argue, or flounce toward the door. He simply turned his back on her and began to take the stairs 2 at a time. Josephine clung to his neck, her face buried in the damp wool of his waistcoat. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She listened to the heavy rhythmic thud of his boots on the stairs, and underneath it, the faint, sharp click of the front door closing. Diana was gone. The audience was gone. By the time they reached her bedchamber, the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving Josephine violently shivering. Her teeth clicked together. Gideon kicked the bedroom door shut behind them and finally set her down on the hearth rug in front of the dead fireplace. Her legs gave out immediately. She sank to her knees, the heavy, wet wool of her dress pooling around her like a swamp. Gideon dropped to his knees beside her. His hands were shaking. He didn't call for her maid. He didn't ring the bell. He reached for the tiny, mud-caked buttons at the collar of her dress. "You are freezing," he muttered, his fingers clumsy against the wet fabric. "I'm a fool. I should have wrapped you in my coat." "Your coat is in the mud," she pointed out, her voice vibrating with a shiver. "Let it rot there," he said fiercely. The buttons were too small, the buttonholes swollen with water. Gideon swore, a harsh, low sound, and grabbed the fabric at her collar with both hands. With a sharp, violent yank, he tore the dress open. The sound of ripping seams was obscenely loud in the quiet room. Josephine gasped, but she didn't stop him. He peeled the heavy, ruined wool off her shoulders, dragging it down her arms and leaving it in a sodden heap on the floor. Beneath it, her white cotton chemise was soaked through, clinging translucently to her skin. Then came the corset. It was a rigid cage of silk and whalebone, designed to mold her into an acceptable shape for polite society. Now, wet and shrinking, it felt like an iron maiden tightening around her ribs. Gideon moved behind her. She felt the heat of his chest against her shivering back. He fumbled with the laces. The silk cords were knotted, swollen tight by the dampness. "I cannot untie it," he breathed, panic edging into his voice. "It's too tight." "Cut it," she whispered. She heard the metallic snap of his pocket knife opening. The cold steel slid between the tight laces in her spine. A quick, sharp slice. The tension shattered. Josephine took a massive, shuddering breath as her ribs finally expanded, the sudden rush of oxygen making her dizzy. Gideon pulled the rigid garment away, tossing it onto the ruined pile of her dress. He moved back around to face her. His hands were smeared with mud from her clothes. His hair was sticking up in wild angles. He looked nothing like the Duke of Rothay, and everything like a man terrified he had broken something precious. He reached out, his large, calloused palms cupping her bare shoulders over the thin cotton chemise. The contrast of his rough, warm skin against her freezing flesh made her gasp. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She lifted her chin. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips blue. He leaned down and kissed her. It was entirely different from the desperate collision on the moor. It was slow, reverent, and deeply grounding. He kissed the cold from her mouth. He tasted her lower lip, his thumb stroking the fragile line of her collarbone. There was no grace in it. Their noses bumped. Her teeth chattered against his. He smelled of sweat and panic. She smelled of peat and rain. It was messy. It was imperfect. "You are not a ledger," he whispered against her mouth, his breath hot on her skin. "You are my wife, and I would burn this house to the ground before I let anyone make you feel small in it." The maids arrived 10 minutes later with steaming buckets of water, stopping dead in the doorway at the sight of the Duke, stripped to his shirt sleeves on his knees on the hearth rug, gently rubbing the mud from his Duchess's cold feet. That night, there was no mechanical routine in the dark. The fire roared in the grate, casting flickering orange shadows across the velvet canopy. Gideon did not wait for her to retreat to the extreme left side of the mattress. He pulled her into the center. When they made love, it wasn't a quiet, instructional duty. It was an awkward, frantic unspooling of 3 months of silence. He was desperate, burying his face in her hair, murmuring her name like a prayer against her neck. Josephine dug her fingers into his shoulders, feeling the deep, rigid tension in his muscles finally give way. She felt the old, faded ridge of the collarbone his father had broken. She traced it with her thumb, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they had both dragged into this bed. He shuddered, pulling her closer, hiding his face against her chest. In the heat and the friction, the ghosts of Oakhaven were banished. 4 weeks later, a Tuesday. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the December frost. Josephine woke before the dawn. She lay perfectly still, staring up at the dark canopy. Gideon's heavy arm was slung over her waist, his face pressed into the pillow beside her shoulder. He was deeply, peacefully asleep, his breath slow and even. She didn't move, because if she moved, the reality would catch up to her. But biology was a cruel, inevitable clock. The deep grinding ache in her lower back flared, radiating down her thighs. A moment later, she felt the familiar warm dampness between her legs. Her breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her forehead. She had failed again. Despite the warmth, despite the newfound intimacy, despite the fact that Gideon now looked at her across the breakfast table and smiled, the fundamental transaction remained unfulfilled. The factory money had cleared the debts, but the broodmare was still defective. Carefully, agonizingly slowly, she slid out from under his heavy arm. The cold air of the room hit her bare skin, raising goosebumps. She wrapped her dressing gown around herself and walked to the washstand in the corner. She poured the water into the basin. It was freezing. She washed herself with a harsh linen cloth. The water in the basin bloomed a pale, rusty pink. The smell of copper hit the air, the scent of her own inadequacy. A tear slipped free, hot and humiliating, tracking down her cheek. She was so tired of this monthly mourning. She gripped the edges of the washstand, her knuckles turning white, trying to silently fight back the sob rising in her throat. Josephine. His voice was thick with sleep, rough and low in the gloom. She jumped, hiding the bloody cloth behind her back. Go back to sleep, Gideon. It is early. The bed springs creaked. He didn't listen. She heard the soft thud of his bare feet on the floorboards. He walked over to her, his large frame blocking out the meager light from the embers. He looked at her rigid posture. He looked at her white knuckles gripping the porcelain. Then his eyes dropped to the pink-tinged water in the basin. He understood instantly. The tightening of the skin around his eyes betrayed him. Josephine squeezed her eyes shut. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words tasted like ash. "I'm sorry. I failed again." The silence in the room stretched out, thin and fragile. She braced herself for the disappointment, the polite, clinical resignation, the quiet withdrawal back to his side of the bed. Instead, a warm, rough hand cupped the back of her neck. Gideon stepped into her space, wrapping his other arm around her waist and pulling her backward against his chest. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about the cold. "Never apologize for this," he murmured, his voice rumbling against her spine. "But the air," she choked out, a sob finally breaking through. "The contract." "Damn the contract," Gideon said softly. He pressed his lips to the crown of her head. "Damn the air. Damn this house. If it crumbles into the mud, we will build a smaller one. I do not care." Josephine opened her eyes, staring at the pink water in the basin, her tears falling freely now. Gideon, I meant what I said, he told her, his grip tightening around her waist, anchoring her in the dark. You are not a vessel, Josephine. You are my wife. And if it is just the two of us haunting these halls for the next 50 years, then I consider myself the luckiest bastard in England. He turned her around. His eyes were completely clear, stripped of any pretense or aristocratic armor. He lifted his hand, using his thumb to wipe the tear from her cheek. Come back to bed, he whispered. It's freezing. He led her back to the center of the mattress. He pulled the heavy comforter up to her chin and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her spine against his chest. He pressed a hot water bottle, which he must have kept near his feet, against her cramping stomach. It wasn't a cure. The blood would still come. The ache would remain. But as Josephine closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and the faint, smoky residue of the fire, the hollow, sickening emptiness in her chest was gone. 2 hours later, they sat at the long mahogany table in the breakfast room. The air was still cold, the oak paneling still dark. Gideon was reading the financial pages. Turn the page, lift the teacup, set it down. Josephine reached for a piece of toast. Beside her plate sat a small crystal jar filled with thick, dark red strawberry preserves. She spooned a generous amount onto her toast, the sweet smell masking the lingering scent of damp wool in the room. Gideon lowered his newspaper just enough to catch her eye over the top of the pages. The corners of his mouth twitched upward in a barely there private smile. Josephine smiled back, took a bite of her toast, and settled in for the morning. If that raw, emotional conclusion made you feel every heartbreak and triumph along with Josephine and Gideon, hit that like button right now. Stories like this prove that true romance isn't about perfect people, but about finding someone who stays when things get messy. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that they are worth more than what they can produce. Did Gideon's reaction in Part 9 redeem him for you? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deeply human historical drama.